Welcome back. A little earlier, we created this scene that we have here, where we have our main camera, the directional lighting, the ground, and the player. In this video, we're going to look a little more into how we can change the components of our player to actually do something. Because if we position the player or this sphere a little higher and we play the game, we will see that the ball is never dropping. So let me zoom in here. You can see the ball is just floating in the air, and that is because the ball or the sphere, the player, doesn't have a component that is relevant for physics. So let's change that real quick. Let's click on the player here and then scroll on the right hand side in the inspector down to the area where you can see we have this add component button. So now click on this button and then you can see that there are physics here, for example. So different types of components, and the one that we are looking at is the physics component, not the 2D, but the general physics without 2D. And here you can select a bunch of different physics that are automatically there in Unity, and that's super cool because it really saves us a lot of time. So here we can just use rigid body. So let's select the rigid body, and we can now see this new component, rigid body, was added to our game object, so to the player. If you click on the ground, you can see it doesn't have the rigid body because we didn't add it there. If we go back to our player, you can see that now we have the rigid body. It has a mass, a certain drag, an angular drag. It uses gravity now, it's kinematic, and so forth. So if we now run the game and we go to the game mode, you can see that our ball fell down. It didn't jump back up, so there was nothing that pushed it back up, which usually would happen with a ball. So this was more like a very heavy metal sphere, let's say, okay? Or maybe a bowling ball that doesn't jump up. It just stays on this rather soft surface, so there was no jumping back. So now there is something that was added by Unity by default as well that we haven't added manually. So let's go back to our scene here and to our ball, to our player. You can see that our player, and by the way, we're running it. So here our player has a sphere collider. So it has a bunch of different components, but the one that I'm interested in is this sphere collider. So a collider is something that can collide with another collider. So our player has a collider, a sphere collider, because it is a sphere. And if you scroll to it, you can see that there is this green line, and this green line indicates where the collider of that sphere is. So it's a sphere collider, so it will collide like a sphere. So it will not collide like a box, for example, which has corners. Okay, so it's all rounded. And then we have the ground, which, if we look at it, has a mesh collider. So we're going to see what the different types of colliders are. For now, what's important is that both of them have a collider, which is why the ball is stopping once it hits the ground. So if I deactivate this mesh collider, for example, and I run the game again, you will see that my ball is just falling through. If we look at our scene, then we can see the ball there. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It's flying further down. Here you can see the y coordinate is going lower and lower. So it's minus 800 at this point and so forth. And that is because there was no collider that would stop it from falling. So now in our scene, we can see that our ball wasn't stopped by the ground. So the ground is not really a ground. It just looks like a ground. So it's more like a cloud maybe. Okay, the cloud doesn't stop the ball from falling. So if we activate the mesh collider here on the right hand side, so this checkbox is active again, this component will be activated. So you can deactivate components that are added to a game object and you can activate it again. So here I'm activating the mesh collider again. If I run it again, you will see that now our ball will stop once it hits the ground. Something else that you might notice is that the color of our sphere is so boring because it's the default material. So let's actually create a new material here. So right click, create, and then go to material. And here, this will be a new material. Let's call this one blue, for example. Now this will be blue, and let me change the color. Here on the right hand side, there is this white box. You can click into it and then you can select a color. So I'm just going to select this bluish color. I'm going to close this pop-up window. And now this is my material. So you can see, even if I click on game objects, on assets, inside of my project window, the inspector will pop up and I can make changes to the asset that I have selected. In this case, it's a material. So I can just drag it onto my ball and now my ball will be blue. So now a little challenge for you, create another material and add that for the ground. So just use a different color and add that to the ground as well. All right, let's go ahead and create a new material by doing right click and material inside of our assets, create and material. So I'm going to create a red material, that's how I'm going to call it. And then I'm going to click on this and you see in my case, this color window popped up and then it disappeared. So this is a little bug that I have in my Unity version because I'm using two screens. So this is something where if you are using two screens also, this can happen. So what I have to do in my case is I have to make sure that I am not extending the displays, but I'm duplicating the displays so that it basically is just one display and then this will pop up again. So for some reason I have this bug. If you have this bug as well, you can fix it this way. So now you see it's all a little smaller because I'm using a different percentage for the UI on my second screen. But here, let's select the red color like so. And let me go back to extending my displays again. Okay, so now I have this red material and let me drag it onto my ground. All right, so now if we run our game, it will look a little better, but you see there's no bounciness. The ball is dropping and we have the different materials and it's very colorful. But now let's actually make the ball bounce off the ground. In order to make something bounce off the ground, we need to change the physical material behavior of our sphere collider. So you can see here in the sphere collider, we can add a physic material. Let's create a physic material that will bounce. So right click into your assets and then go ahead and create a physic material. So there are the materials that are the colors, and then there are the physic materials which will allow you to add friction or bounciness to your game. So I'm going to call this one bouncing, and this will be my bouncing material. And here I'm going to add bounciness of 1 to it. Okay, so enter the value of 1. This will mean it will bounce quite a bit. And then let's add that to our player's sphere collider. So click on the player. Then open your sphere collider here, make sure that the component is opened and expanded, and then you can drag this bounciness to the material right here. So now let's run this and see what happens. And you see our ball bounces a little bit. So if the ball was a little higher, it would bounce more. So let's position the ball just a tiny bit higher, like so, and run the game again. And you will see that it will bounce a little bit. So now let's actually make the ball jump with our own component as well. Because we can add more components to our player, right? We had this script that we created earlier, which we called new behavior script, which is the default name. We didn't change the name of it. Let's actually get rid of it because we're not using it anywhere. But then let's actually create a new script. So here, right click, create, and then select C# script, and I'm going to call this one jump. Okay, so this script will take care of jumping. So let's double click on it, and then Visual Studio will open up and you will see this code. So no worries, we're going to go over what code does and how all of this works. But for now, the only thing that you need to understand is that this jump code here, this jump class, is going to allow us to add a certain behavior to our player. In our case, what I want to happen is I want the player to jump. In order to jump, I'm going to check in every single frame if a key was pressed. In my case, I'm going to press the space bar in order to execute a little jump. So I'm going to check if the input was get key down, and here is going to be space. So basically, if we press the space key, what is it that we want to execute? Well, if that happens, what I want to add is a little bit of force towards the ball that will push the ball up. Okay, so I'm going to say this get component, and we are going to get the rigid body of the component that we assigned the script to, add a little bit of force that will transform the player up. So basically, which will push his transform up by, let's say, something like 500F. F stands for float. We're going to see what float are. We're going to see what this transform means, what add fours are, and so forth. So for now, just copy this code and put it into your jump.cs file and save it. So just quickly, what's happening here? Every single frame, this update method will be executed. So every single frame, it's going to check if we press the space key. If we did press the space key, then the rigid body component, which is the component that takes care of the gravity, for example, of the ball, of the physics in general of the ball, what we're going to say is take this rigid body that takes care of the physics and add a little bit of force to it. And in which direction do we want to add the force? Well, we want to add the force towards up. So let the player jump up. By how much do we want to jump him up? By 500, whatever this is. Okay, so let's just say we push him a little bit up with a bat from the bottom, so to speak. So now let's go over to our player and let's make sure that we add this jump script to the player. So therefore we can drag it just right here to the player. So let me add that here, and you can see now there is this jump script that was added. All right, so now let's run this and press the space key. And you see the ball is jumping. And let's press the space key again. You see the ball is jumping. If you press the space key multiple times, you will see that the ball is going up quite a bit. Actually, it's off the field as it seems. So we made him jump super, super high. So that's something where we would need to add a check. When was the last time that we pressed jump, and only allow to press jump if the ball is at the ground, for example. But that's something that we're going to learn and cover later on in the course. For now, what was important for you to understand is that you have something called components that you can add to a game object, such as the player, for example, or the ground, or any other element that you add to your hierarchy here on the left-hand side. And by adding components, you add behavior to the game object. And this then allows you to create your game. So what we added is, we added a material that changed the color. We added bounciness to the sphere collider, which is the collider that takes care of collision so that things can stop each other, so to speak. So the ball is being stopped from falling because it has added gravity by this component rigid body. And then we added a script to it, which added behavior that allowed us to make the player jump once we press a key. Okay, that's it for this video. See you in the next one.